Published by Interplay in October 1997, Fallout was an ambitious CRPG that managed to create a unique world and lore set in the post-nuclear wasteland of a destroyed United States. Filled with clever character building, progression, interactions, environments, and quality of craft, Fallout was, and remains, a landmark release for role-playing games. Its choices in design, both mechanical, aesthetic, and narrative, continue to be examples for the genre that developers should aspire to emulate and perfect. All this from a game that sells itself as being about preventing dehydration. Fallout's manual is more like a full-on guidebook and a resource for coming into the game world. It's rich and full of detail of not only the mechanics of the game, allowing players to familiarize themselves with the various complex systems, but also of world lore, describing in detail the effects of nuclear detonation and fallout. The manual gives the player a good sense of what the game is about tonally, and does so from the perspective of both an in-lore corporation and with influence notes by the Vault Overseer. Video game manuals like this are practically supplemental materials that add to the game's value, and often are necessary resources for understanding the game's systems. Most aspects of Fallout will prove to be fairly intuitive, but a resource such as this is incredibly useful, especially given the game's lack of tutorials and its publishing in the days before internet guides and walkthroughs were commonplace. The game opens with propaganda, an old-fashioned broadcast of United States troops annexing Canada, wherein a US soldier is seen killing a bound Canadian with a firearm before giving a patriotic thumbs up to the camera. The screen flickers to advertisements for 1950s to 60s designs of cars before panning out to reveal the devastated post-nuclear world. This is a fantastic method of setting a multiplicitous tone for the world the player is soon to enter. Oppressive and lighthearted at the same time, or perhaps flippant would be more accurate. We then get the expositional introduction on how war never changes, showing the alternate history of Fallout in a surprisingly brisk fashion. After World War II, every major nation started fighting over resources, mostly to fuel an exaggerated Cold War arms race ideology. Until 2077, when the bombings came to pass, irreparably impacting the world and eliminating nearly all life. Your character is a remnant of what was left from the vaults, a project to protect small groups of individuals in the event of such an apocalypse. We then deviate to the inciting incident of the story, dehydration. The vault's water chip is broken and everyone's running out of water. The player character is tasked to find a new one, being released for the first time into the wasteland. The introductory cinematics and the pre-renders on display here are quite well stylized, and the voice acting is commendable.
I think you're the only hope we have.
Fallout's intro is succinct and effective, and is a microcosm of the quality that will be on display for the entirety of a playthrough. From here, you're tasked with selecting, modifying, or creating a character. While the pre-made characters are interesting, holding both small backstories and embodying major playstyle archetypes, they're not the ideal choice for most players. Making a unique character is where the player is given the most agency, and also the most consequence for their choices in the game to come. Characters are governed by a few parameters: special, skills, traits, and perks. Special is an acronym for the player's major statistics: strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. Each of these has different effects depending on how high or low they are. Strength determines hit points or health, carrying capacity for items, melee damage, and is a prerequisite to being able to properly hold and use just about every weapon in the game. Perception determines ranged accuracy and influences turn order. Endurance determines hit points gained through levels, status resistance, and healing. Charisma is supposed to determine how much people like you, but in actual gameplay has little to no bearing. Intelligence determines skill point gains, influences dialogue options and certain skills. Agility grants action points, or more chances to do things in combat. Armor class, otherwise known as chance to evade. Sequence, the player's place in turn order, and many skills. Luck affects critical chances and is for gambling. Each of these stats can be modified to create a variety of starting characters. Each stat starts at 5, and you have 5 points to spend on any of them. More if you're willing to subtract from other skills. This can result in some characters being well-rounded but not particularly good at anything, or really good at some things and absolutely terrible at others. Most players recommend starting with 9 intelligence, 1 charisma, and other stats no lower than 4. Skills are a list of actions the player may use throughout their adventure, with a percentage chance of success that can be raised up to a maximum of 200%. This anomaly of a percentage is made specifically for the combat skills, but all skills can, in theory, be raised above 100%. The reason for this is that the combat skills influence chance to hit in a percentage, which is also negatively impacted by several other factors, thereby meaning that for a guarantee to hit in all environments, a combat skill must be raised above 100%. This does not apply to non-combat skills. Character creation allows the player to tag 3 skills to start for an increase to skill points gained in level ups. You spend skill points on said skills every time you level up to a maximum of 21 to increase their percentage. Lastly, there are traits, completely optional modifications that have both positives and negatives to them. You can choose 2 of them at the start. Some are made better than others. Small frame gives you an extra point to agility at the cost of a lower starting carrying capacity, whereas jinxed makes everyone and everything in the game critically unlucky. This is a fairly strong character creation system for role-playing, giving a variety of options and effects for different playstyles. It can be somewhat overwhelming to look at, especially for those unfamiliar with tabletop character creation, of which this derives. The biggest flaw for character creation is only seen if you fuck it up. Setting certain stats such as strength too low will end your playthrough before it begins. Some may consider this a positive that the game lets you make a failure of a character, but it still has put enough people off to the point where every guide, review, and video on the game tells you what not to do, like this one. When you've made your choices for your character, the game begins. Most of Fallout's gameplay occurs in these isometrically viewed environments, cells, which the player explores by directing their character with the mouse. To move perspective, or the camera, the mouse is moved to the edges of the screen. Moving the cursor will show one of 3 icons cycled through by right-clicking. A red hexagon representing the movement action, showing viable places for the character to move to. A variable cursor icon representing context-sensitive interactions such as speaking, opening doors, and grabbing items from containers. And lastly, a red circular crosshair cursor representing the attack action. Click with red hexagon, move. Click with red crosshair, punch, stab, or shoot. Click with the magic cursor, and God help you if you're standing in front of a door. Click on buttons on the UI for menus, click on dialogue options for NPC chatter. While I applaud the simplicity of relegating controls to the mouse and the multiplicity of functions for a singular input, it can and does result in some mild issues in overall fluidity of gameplay. It's primarily cumbersome to switch between the movement and context-sensitive cursors, and honestly, somewhat unnecessary. The movement outside of combat could be consolidated to the context-sensitive actions and save the player the annoyance of not being able to move to a tile while using the interaction cursor. Where possible, I spent most of the game moving in cells by interacting with objects to save myself the right-clicking. The problem with this approach reveals another mild annoyance in general navigation, that being the range limit for the cursor. After a certain point, even if you click a valid tile to move or interact with, if it's too far away from the player, they'll not move towards it. Perhaps it's a pathfinding limitation, but it becomes tedious to click several spots on the map just to make your way to one point you actually want to go to. Even so, exploring the environments the game offers in these cells is fairly interesting, although it can vary by area. Some interior cells, like the cave the player starts in, are visually pleasing, but can feel blocky and like it was made with prefabs. This isn't a complaint on the development per se. Making prefab tiles is a fairly solid method of efficiently creating spaces in a grid-like environment, but the consequence of this is mild repetition in environmental design, over-reliance on grid structure, and can at times lack detail. In my experience with Fallout, this is the exception, not the rule, and the repetition of spaces is largely evident in underground interior cells that are overly large in scale. Adjacent to exploration in Fallout is the combat, usually brought upon the player without their request. A variety of irradiated and mutated animals and humanoids will attack the player on sight. It's possible to avoid some encounters with a high enough sneak skill, but it's usually a better option to engage hostiles for the experience. Maybe not so much with the 25 XP rats in the introduction, but at least it lets you feel out the basics. The game's turn-based combat is seamlessly integrated into cell exploration, and when an enemy is engaged, they'll be highlighted in red. It's at this point that most players will learn about the third cursor, the crosshair, as it requires the player to click on their equipped weapon to ready a target outside of combat. There are a variety of weapons and weapon skills for the player to play around with. Small guns, unarmed, and melee are usually a safe start due to forgiving starting accuracy and weapon frequency, but players can also utilize big guns and energy weapons and even throwables throughout their journey as their chosen tool of destruction. Equipped weapons can have multiple functions: standard single fire, targeted single fire, burst, reload, and so on. Some of these choices are more effective depending on playstyle and situation. Everything the player does in combat costs action points, of which there's a maximum of 10. Moving tiles costs 1 action point per tile, perk not included. Opening your inventory costs a maximum of 4 AP, reduced with another perk. and every weapon action costs a different amount of AP depending on the weapon and function. Barehanded attacks cost less than single fire of most weapons, and targeted attacks cost 1 extra AP. Most attacks in the game are single target, but shotguns have a burst function that fires in a cone pattern, and there are explosive weapons which do damage in an area. The pressure to determine movement, positioning, ammo management, ability to attack, and the type of attack you do all being tied to a finite resource makes each turn the player has in combat feel strategic, and opens up interesting decision-making opportunities. A common conundrum in combat is choosing whether to do a standard non-targeted attack to preserve AP, or to possibly do more damage with a targeted attack instead. Targeted attacks allow the player to select a specific body part of an enemy, each with different chances of hitting, with certain parts dealing more damage. This system makes attacks feel a little more planned out, but in the actual gameplay, the fact that enemies' weak points are pretty consistently the head or eyes feels like a missed chance to create more interrogative combat sequences, especially considering the limb degradation system present in Fallout. If you target a specific body part enough, it will break, leaving an enemy, or the player, with a restriction in terms of combat options. Broken eyes reduce accuracy, broken legs slow or omit movement, broken arms make it harder or impossible to use certain weapons. The limb degradation system is also impacted somewhat by its perceived lack of consequences against enemies, where even in the event that you do break an enemy's arm, leg, or blind it, they'll still act without observable penalty. This isn't actually the case. The enemies do get penalized just as the player does for these things, but in an average encounter you rarely notice the difference, so much so that this actually applies to players as well. There was a significant portion of my playthrough where I outright forgot that I had a broken arm, and only realized it when I tried to equip a two-handed weapon, and then still didn't fix it for another hour. If it were more common for enemy types to have weak points placed in different locations and to exaggerate the damage to broken limbs, discovering those weak points could be a facet of play unto itself. It could be further developed so that enemies have more varied defensive limbs or target points, so that the player is discouraged from actively attacking them. A practical example of this would be having a humanoid enemy with steel pants and no helmet, and another humanoid enemy with no pants and a steel helmet. The enemy with a helmet is resistant or outright immune to attacks to the head, but is weak in the legs because they don't have anything there. I think to a degree the game tries to accomplish this with some creatures, notably mutated non-humanoids like rad scorpions who are supposed to be weak in their stinger. It just doesn't happen to a frequent enough degree. AP also has a secondary function in that any AP you don't use when you end your turn is converted to armor class for that turn. Armor class weirdly affects the chance to be hit, not damage mitigation. But if you hit the end turn button, or your AP reaches 0, your turn is over. Turn order is also a consideration in Fallout, though the functionality of it is somewhat obscured. There's a mechanic called sequence, which determines who goes first in combat and can be put in the player's favor with a higher perception score and certain perks. Regardless, the combat is sufficiently satisfying, has a decent amount of depth and variety to it, and doesn't generally outstay its welcome. Exceptions to this only occur in rare late-game scenarios where massive groups of enemies are in combat with the player and amongst themselves, leaving substantial downtime where you watch enemies take their turns one by one, waiting to engage. And in large areas, you won't always see who's acting unless you fly the camera all around the map for the whole turn. The overall experience with combat in Fallout is positive, and engaging enough to the point where I wouldn't mind repeatedly throwing my stubborn ass at the same encounter 20 times until I eventually got decent enough luck to hit and dodge consistently. Outside of major points of interest, the game has an abstraction of the overworld and a tiled system that elapses time as the player traverses it. Movement in the world map comes down to either clicking a point on the map or the button next to a known location name. An arrow representing the player will move towards where you selected, occasionally getting stopped by random encounters with merchants, enemies, or just sometimes stopping for your character to vomit from radiation poisoning. If you are stopped, you have to reselect where you were going after leaving the cell that the encounter takes place in. The world map from a mechanical standpoint is a serviceable abstraction to make the game world feel more expansive, encapsulating a significant chunk of post-nuclear Southern California. It isn't particularly engaging, but it's not off-putting either. Points of interest on said world map, whether they be towns or some kind of dungeon-like environment, or where the game actually shines in terms of exploration. Fallout settlements and landmarks, the interior cells, are often unique settings that house the role-playing depth of the game. The major towns of Fallout are varied in visual design as well as narrative function, making visiting each location engaging. Finding new characters, factions, and things to do holds the player's interest well into the endgame. While the complaint leveled against repetitive prefabs for certain dungeons still applies, the game does do a good job in adding small variation to the big offenders, that being sewers, caves, and vaults, and in contextualizing the similarity between certain environments, particularly vaults. Vaults are supposed to look similar, since they're repetitive commercial industrial developments made of similar blueprints and designs. Yes, that's just an excuse, but it's the one we're going with. The points of interest are not nearly as interesting without the interactions that take place within them, and the major NPCs of Fallout are exemplary methods of giving life to the dead world they're in. I'm fond of the way that Fallout differentiates primary and secondary NPCs through the truncation of dialogue and the method through which it's displayed. A secondary NPC will only ever have a small blip of text appear above their head when passed or interacted with to indicate their function as flavor to the world, whereas primary NPCs offer a unique dialogue window that features branching options for the player to ask questions and make confirmations within. It's a quick way to tell the player which characters are and are not important, but still requires players to interact with the environment nonetheless. Actually utilizing the dialogue system in Fallout comes down to choosing branching options from lists, but the game generally does a good job of having variety and cohesion for all chosen options. Some questions lead to different lines of questions or comments, and so on. It's a good opportunity to give the player a chance to define their character's action through these branches, asserting how inquisitive, brash, timid, or helpful the player character is through this system. Fallout does have some leniency in how dialogue functions, allowing players to go down the same dialogue branch more than once to see different outcomes in a conversation. It's forgiving from a mechanical standpoint to let the player reread dialogue or go down a different branch, but there are instances where it feels like the first option a player chooses in dialogue should be definitive and not be able to be run over. A contentious example of this is in the mid-game unmarked quest involving Iguana Bob. If you uncover his secret, you can blackmail him with it and attempt to extort money out of him. Tell him you might go to the police, scream about what he's done to the whole town, let the whole thing go, or provoke him into fighting you. If you present incorrect evidence or choose not to do anything particular about it, you can just immediately redo the dialogue from the beginning by clicking him again. It's forgiving, but not committal or necessarily contextually appropriate for the circumstances. To be honest, I'm not sure whether this approach is right or wrong. On the subject of quests, this is the primary motivator for progression throughout the game. You talk to an NPC, ask some questions, find out about their problems, and usually offer to help. The game gives a good variety of major and minor quests to fill the game world, and in many cases makes the player feel as though their choices have had an impact on the world itself. Not to mention, these quests have multiple approaches, outcomes, and twists that can completely change how they play out. I have to commend Fallout's quest design in that it's very consistent in offering the players a wide degree of choices in how they want to handle just about any quest. It speaks to not just diligence in designing for a great many contingencies in how a player might handle a quest, but shows a significant amount of respect for the players themselves in giving them such agency in how a quest can play out based on their choices. It's really well-defined role-playing in the actual role-playing game, if you can believe it. Some characters can talk their way out of problems, some can sneak their way out, some can blast their way out. Furthermore, the quests deploy a frequent technique of letting the player double-cross or do a moral 180 on how a quest starts. An example of this is in Junktown, where the player meets the mayor Killian Darkwater, watches and potentially helps avert an attempt on his life, and then is asked to get a confession out of the person responsible for putting out the hit on him. The players can, if they want to, side with the person who wants them dead. There's an openness to the quests on offer in Fallout that really assists in bolstering player agency, and establishes significant replay value to see how alternative branches unfold. Not every quest is necessarily that complex, but the majority are, even if they're not main story content. Alternatively, instead of just talking to NPCs, the player can also trade with them in the barter function. If an NPC is willing to trade, and is something worth trading for, then items that the player finds on their adventure can be traded in exchange for other items or essential currency. Merchants, and especially merchants of note, are not common in the wasteland of Fallout, and thereby makes inventory management and the trading of goods a fairly significant consideration. Players' barter is affected by a skill of the same name influencing prices, and carry capacity is a major consideration for the majority of the game, particularly for players who use armor and heavy weapons. You can make a decently consistent profit in the early game if you have high carry capacity and loot a bunch of low-weight weapons, but by the time you reach late game, hold a heavy suit of power armor and have a rocket launcher, looting becomes a careful question of what you can and should hold on to, what's worth giving something else up for to sell, and so on. With Fallout, I actually had to think about what I was carrying more than I do with most RPGs. What I was using versus what I wanted to use. Illustrative of a general trend of Fallout, and many other CRPGs from what I understand, is this more cerebral approach to design. Not that you have to be smarter to play it, but it's a game that's much harder to turn your brain off for. You actually have to be thinking about not just what you're doing now, but what you might be doing later. I appreciate that, even if it can be exhausting at times. As far as RPGs go, the progression systems in Fallout are pretty standard. Choose your starting statistics, strength, weaknesses, and so on. But the player will nearly universally start as generally unskilled in most facets. The completion of quests and killing of enemies rewards experience that then contributes to level ups that allow the player to invest more points into various stats and skills, making themselves better at certain things. It's a numerically centered way to gate progression so that players usually aren't able to steamroll straight to the end of a more openly designed world. It's a decently satisfying method to simulate the feeling of growth and development of skill in a game that requires forethought and commitment to decisions rather than dexterity, aim, and reaction time. Fallout's utilization of the statistical progression system generally succeeds in making players feel like they've grown, and adequately delineates certain parts of the game for a more generally intended and directed experience. Starting out, the player will be decent at maybe at most 3 things that they choose, but will miss attacks often, fail skill checks often, and overall have room for improvement. My only qualm with progression in this matter is that the game for all intents and purposes requires an at least somewhat well-rounded character in order to function, but also heavily pushes for the player to specialize into things and exclusivity very early on. This leads to a reputation for the game that there are right and wrong ways to make a character, which is kind of true. Say for instance you try to min-max special stats so that your character is extremely lucky and agile, but to do so sacrifice strength as far down as it can go. It seems like a good idea if you're using guns until you realize that all weapons in Fallout have a strength requirement to be used properly, and failing to meet that means your accuracy is severely punished. You can make a character that would be incredible with guns if they had the upper body strength to hold it, but instead Captain Noodle Arms is stuck flailing around because you lowered the stat too much. On the one hand, I appreciate systems that discourage min-maxing as it becomes more of a test of how much you can break the game, but Fallout somehow still has this problem. It's heavily favored for players to completely bypass charisma, near-max intelligence, agility, and have high strength, endurance, and perception. Start with specialization in unarmed, melee weapons, or small guns, and to maybe invest in speech. These skills are nearly universally required to have a decent time in the early game. To not fall behind the curve of progress, players are heavily encouraged to continue investing in their starting weapon skill of choice to at least 100%, but the late game progression discourages this as large weapons and energy weapons have the highest damage, making players inevitably switch to using those skills in most cases. It wants the player to be committed at first, then switch completely or fall behind, at least in terms of combat skills. Otherwise, progression feels satisfying, and is interesting to find what niches of skills are favorable to your playstyle, thereby receiving more investment. I initially thought my character would be using first aid and doctor skills a great deal, but in the end I barely got doctor above 30%. Instead, I started putting skill points into science and repair to get more information out of certain interactions. I thought the perks I chose would be combat focused, but I put more into carrying extra stuff by the end. By the end game, you can still make your character a monster with ridiculous stats and skills, but the game never makes you feel invincible thanks to a critical hit system that bypasses defenses. It can be annoying as hell when it happens, but late game enemies will either do no damage at all, or one-shot you. There's no in-between. Otherwise, you trample the lower level enemies by endgame and feel like you earned your way there. Fallout's writing is quite entertaining, and especially succeeds in juggling both grim tone and joviality between and within interactions. It's not obnoxiously in your face with its humor, and usually integrates it as an optional facet of dialogue for less serious players. A fair chunk of the lighter writing comes in the form of pop cultural references. This can sometimes be amusing, but also comes off a little like a crossover, where you see a character or thing you recognize and have the "oh I know them" and point at the screen moment. Over-reliance on this can diminish the long-term relatability of a work. It can alienate readers, and it kinda comes off as a little bit lazy. I don't necessarily think Fallout reaches this point. Most pop culture references are spread out and sometimes rather subtle. It's a fine line, however, and some may find it grating, but making most of these an optionally integrated part of dialogues relegates their role to one that's largely inoffensive. Fallout does really well in finding and making fun of the absurdity of such heavy subject matter as world-ending apocalypses. The intro, as we mentioned, shows the soldier shooting a kneeling presumed Canadian, killing them, then looking at the camera and giving a thumbs up like they're a hero. There's a whole option for low intelligence dialogue choices.
How dare you speak to me in that manner? You will be punished for your insolence. Guards!
There's a Shakespearean British guy who runs a thieves guild.
Let's get the other bit of politeness taken care of, shall we? What the bloody hell are you doing here?
in a post-nuclear western. The game can also be pretty overt with how heavy the subject matter can be, but the extremity of the circumstances in many cases make the game almost feel disconnected, like reading a superhero comic where it's just too out there to hit home, even if its setting may literally be in your home. Super mutant uprisings, nuclear Armageddon, life and death situations with a lone hero, that sort of thing. Overall, Fallout makes going through its narrative and interactions a pleasant experience, and for a first entry in a series, establishes a very interesting world and unique characters that flesh out the fictional setting. Not to mention, dialogue isn't overly long or expositional, despite having a lot of background detail. It was rare for me to skip through dialogue at all. I was interested enough to want to talk to everyone in the game. It takes a lot for a game to hold your attention like that, but the writing in Fallout, particularly in NPC interaction, does a lot of the heavy lifting in that regard, and makes the role-playing feel deep and varied. Despite being very bleak from a visual design perspective, Fallout's visuals are surprisingly charming. Every object, area, and character comes off as being appropriately aged, dirty, and grimy for the post-nuclear world they exist within. The UI heavily utilizes rusted materials in its design and is committed to making even high-tech feel somewhat antiquated, as is the case with the actual lore of the game. Environments, particularly the ruins and settled remains of cities, are often constructed with corrugated metal walls or take place within the rare, unbroken remains of darkened brick buildings. It's wonderfully moody and in line with the idea that everything that remains of this destroyed world is in a ramshackle state, barely eking out an existence for itself in the dangerous remnants of what came before. Almost nothing is neat and clean, and the rare exceptions to that are the most isolated and homogeneous sections of the pre-nuclear world, like Vault 13 and the Brotherhood of Steel Sanctuary. They give off a sense of being manufactured, and that they don't fit in with the state of the world, but are intentionally so. Much of the game's visuals consist of pre-rendered materials made into sprites and tiles. Environments, though somewhat simple at times, look pleasant and are mostly easy to navigate. Character and item sprites are well scaled and detailed and fit in with the world they occupy. There's a way that many objects in the game reflect light in their renders that gives off an impression of clay modeling and claymation at times, most easily seen in objects like cars, the Master, and certain irradiated creatures of the wasteland. It seems part of the method of creating assets for the game was to sculpt clay models and then give them extra detail through modeling software. This approach, I think, is part of what gives the visuals such charm, especially when viewing character renders and dialogue in cutscenes. They have a mild level of grit and realism to them, but are rounded off enough to not be uncanny. I really think that Fallout does a great job with the visual direction, especially for its 1997 release. Audio fares well for Fallout as well. Sound effects are appropriate and add detail to a cold and empty world. The music in the game is an interesting choice too. Many tracks have an oppressive, airy quality to them that makes them feel weighty but unintrusive to the circumstances you hear them in. In other instances, the game will be without music and feature just ambient noise. In both cases, it instills a fitting atmosphere of loneliness and desolation. Nothing stands out, but I think that if the audio design were to do so, it would distract from these aforementioned themes, so I applaud the decision to keep the sounds to the back, as it were. Fallout's story has a deceptively simple concept. Vault 13 needs a replacement water chip, so they send you out to find a new one. Fail, and the vault will perish. It's in the progression of said story that Fallout will reveal it's about a fair bit more than that. Vault 13's overseer recommends going to the nearest vault, Vault 15, to the east. On the way to Vault 15, you encounter the community of Shady Sands, the residents of which will inform the player about other major settlements known as Junktown and the Hub. Technically, this, along with a wide degree of content in the story, is optional, as you can reach most locations without consulting other characters. It's included here as it's part of intended progression, and because it has some impact on the ending. Speaking to Katrina at the gate of Shady Sands reveals that Vault 15 was attacked some time ago and has since been abandoned. The player can alternatively find this by going straight to the vault themselves. Given this lack of answers, the player is forced to look elsewhere, and the best places to do so would be where the people are. Passing through Junktown, the Vault Dweller eventually reaches the hub, where the water merchants are headquartered. If anyone knows about a water chip, it would most likely be them. Speaking to the head of the water merchants reveals that they don't possess a water chip, but can aid Vault 13 with stocks of water to buy the player and the vault extra time. The main story and several quests in Fallout feature a time limitation to add pressure and urgency to the objectives, but the limit itself is usually so lenient that an entire playthrough can be completed before Vault 13 would run out of water. It is possible to fail the main objective if you wander aimlessly and intentionally choose not to progress, but it's honestly pretty hard to do so without trying. I chose not to supplement Vault 13's water supplies. From this point, my experience with the story becomes a little bit murky, because I started aiming for other settlements on my own investigative journey. I can't speak to the intended progression because the game is pretty respectful and open-ended in letting you explore in spite of the time pressure. From the hub, regardless of whether or not you supplement the water supplies, your next leads are other settlements that townsfolk refer to, the Brotherhood of Steel, Necropolis, and the Boneyard. Only one of these places has the water chip we need. Despite becoming a member of the Brotherhood, they couldn't help me with my water problem. A shame given that they are the technological preservation society. If anybody should have it, it's them. Necropolis is the real next destination, and the one that'll matter more for a water issue. A town of ghouls divided, these mutated humans fill the streets above and the sewers below, surviving off a water chip in the vault connected to the sewers. One could just take the chip and leave, but there are associated quests and decisions that can be made so that the vault dweller isn't such a selfish prick. This is an aspect of the game that I'll try to hold off talking about for its own segment, but the delineation between main and side content of Fallout is blurry at times, as just about everything you do has relevance, mandatory or not. Most ghouls on the surface are hostile, but the ones in the sewers ask you to holster your weapon when you approach. They aim to exist peacefully in Necropolis, but are also struggling to maintain the water supplies to do so. The group of ghouls on the surface have relegated the water to their faction, and so the sewer dwellers inquire if you can assist in finding a fix. I found the junk components and repaired the water pump, allowing me to take the vault's water chip without endangering the ghouls' water supply. While in Necropolis, you may come across a hulking, buff-ass mutant, who will become relevant shortly. My experience with him was just to confuse him into letting me pass. Returning to Vault 13 a hero, the Overseer thanks you, only to immediately send you back out of the vault to deal with a more pervasive threat. If you engaged with enough characters and delved into quests, you'd discover that the buff super mutants are becoming more and more common, and people have been disappearing throughout the wasteland. Some in the wasteland conclude correctly, somehow, that this is basically a genetic experiment and transformation process to convert humans into mutants, who then attack other humans who resist. The Overseer then tasks you with genocide. Destroy the mutant threat. No big deal. This came as a bit of a shock to me given that I hadn't yet fully connected the dots in my playthrough, and the only super mutants I encountered seemed relatively harmless. In any event, the Brotherhood of Steel provides the best leads from this point, since the game wants you to investigate the state of the world for yourself. The Brotherhood speaks of missing patrols to the north, where there's a military base in which the super mutants are gathered. Exploring the facility reveals that they have in fact been converting humans into super mutants through a genetic virus, but need certain qualified candidates that have not been immunized to its concentrated effects through long-term exposure to small doses in the wasteland. Prime candidates such as the humans of Vault 13. There is an option and ending where you acquiesce to the super mutants, or get forcefully converted into a super mutant yourself and raid Vault 13, converting everyone who survives into more super mutants. We're not doing that for several reasons. One, the slaughter and forced conversion of our peers doesn't seem like a particularly good idea, and two, the super mutants have a major long-term flaw. They can't procreate. You can find this out through the Brotherhood scribes, but my learning of it there was devoid of an impact that it should have had later in the game. Regardless, we destroyed the super mutant conversion facility to stop their continued creation, and make our way back to the vault, forgetting that there's a head to this movement. After getting mildly reamed out by the Overseer for my oversight, we were directed to pursue the mysterious entity known as the Master. Our investigations lead us to the Boneyard, the ruins of Los Angeles, where we learn that a strange cult called the Children of the Cathedral center their operations, and are also likely involved in the human disappearances. The dots are connected and the player is encouraged to raid their cathedral in search of its secrets. What do you know? The cathedral is hiding a vault where the Master is heading his operations. Destroy the cultist and confront the Master. The main ending here is approachable in a few ways. One can join the Master, getting the ending previously mentioned, go straight to the reactor and set a detonation timer on it, ignoring the Master completely, kill the Master, or manage to talk the Master out of his own plans by revealing to him the lack of long-term viability of the super mutants as a species. This last option is the one I was referring to earlier about learning that information about the mutants from the Brotherhood. It should be a check to give the dialogue option, but something didn't add up in my playthrough, so I never got the option to tell the Master their mutants were sterile. In any event, the Cathedral and the Master are destroyed, and all should be well in the wasteland. Right? No. You see, the way I played the game was simultaneously not thorough enough, and too thorough for my own good. Fallout's ending has a bunch of variables that influence it, much of which is tied to what you choose to do or not do in the wasteland, and how quickly you manage to do it. I knew going in that there was an impact on how long you took to do certain things in the game, but research for this analysis review or whatever post-playthrough revealed that timing is much more important than I realized. My ending consisted of several bad outcomes for major settlements because I took too long to reach them or resolve their conflicts. Necropolis thankfully turned out okay, but the followers of the Apocalypse, the de facto Nice Folk faction, got wiped out because I took more than 90 days to kill the Master. Or that I left a cathedral spy in the faction, I'm not entirely sure. I didn't even know there was a spy. Junktown went under stable management from one Killian Darkwater, whom I helped to consolidate power and law in the region. The Brotherhood remained neutral, which is actually its good ending. The hub got chased off by mutants because, well, I think I failed it in just about every way you could. I don't think I did the caravan quest properly. I took a quest from a fella named Decker, more on that later, and my playthrough took a total of at least 7 in-game months to complete. Needless to say, I thoroughly and completely fucked that one up. I also completely forgot about a faction called the Khans, which started raiding all over the region. They also resulted in the death of a character from Shady Sands, at which no point did I remember being kidnapped by them, and I visited late game. That one's particularly non-canon for, reasons. The NCR doesn't exist without Tandy and Aradesh alive. Tandy dies in my ending as a result of inaction, and Aradesh dies later. Fitting for how badly I left things, the game throws your character a gut punch right at the end, as even though you saved your vault from 2 crises, you're banished from returning for fear that it'll make the other residents also want to explore the wasteland. Under very specific circumstances, you can also kill the Overseer, but that's a jackass option, and though satisfying, feels completely unnecessary. I did touch on it a little bit through the ending, but the division, or lack thereof, between important story content and side objectives in Fallout is noteworthy. The game does an exceptional job of intertwining all narrative threads into a greater tapestry without forcing you to engage with the entirety of the work. In its design, it harbors a great deal of respect for player freedom, and encourages player inquisition for the broader picture in a very satisfying manner. The open-ended nature of the story progression and lack of distinct delineation between major and minor content does make it difficult to sort what is and isn't relevant to the main story, hence my failure to achieve the good endings in many results. My lack of awareness or preparedness for how and what interactions were important meant that some things that I consider to be secondary to the main plot are more important than I let on. Not to mention I guaranteedly missed a fair bit. But I want to use this opportunity to touch on the variety of content not covered in my interpretation of the main story. Every town is rich in character, quests, lore, and factions that greatly enhance the overall experience of Fallout and help to define your character's place in this wasteland. Starting chronologically, Shady Sands is the first stopover with optional things to do. It's a pleasant town and largely self-sufficient, a task that seems to be a miracle for the state of the wasteland at this time. Residents are skeptical of the Vault Dweller at first, but will grow to appreciate their contributions to the town. You can optimize the harvest of Shady Sands by informing the farmer of crop rotation. You hear about a threat of rad scorpions near the town, and can be tasked with both finding an antidote to their poison and clearing out the nearby nest, greatly benefiting the small town and its people. The antidote also functions as a procurable consumable for the player to counteract poison for themselves. Shady Sands directs the dweller to Junktown, a metallic ramshackle fortification of a town that's home to honest folk, gamblers, small-time gangs, and one big-time gangster. In this town, you most likely first meet the mayor Killian Darkwater, who after a brief introduction is nearly killed by an assassin, allegedly, sent by one Gizmo. After disposing of the assassin, Killian requests that you, the guy he just met, help him get a confession out of Gizmo, the crime boss and casino owner of Junktown. I enjoyed this conflict, but it seems a little odd that Gizmo is tolerated as much as he is. Surely someone else in the actual lawless wasteland would be happy to kill Gizmo. You can, by the way. Getting Gizmo to confess is laughably easy. All you have to do is have the recorder Killian gives you in your inventory, then tell Gizmo that you, despite being involved in the killing of his assassin, want to now do the assassination for him. You can, by the way. It's possible to 180 the quest and side with Gizmo if you want to. Once you return with the confession, you can end the quest there, or go with Killian to arrest Gizmo. And by arrest, I mean kill. This quest is a great example of giving players extensive choice, and letting them pivot positions if they're not committed, or if they want to play a sneaky double-crosser. Junktown also features a small-time gang that does, or did, Gizmo's busy work, which really comes off as a few kids and weirdos trying to be considered rough and tough. They loudhouse at the loud house and get rough at the bar, but a few of them are not too objectionable. They're small-time. The bigger issue in Junktown is their doctor. 1, he has a minion trapped in his basement, and 2, he's a cannibal. Needless to say, his time with the Vault Dweller was short but violent. They say you are what you eat, and all that's left of him is meat. That joke fucking blows. You're also introduced to the only companion I found in the game, Dogmeat. If you wear leather armor while in Junktown, the dog just south of the bar will start following you around. They're quite useful in that they can help you out in combat and are surprisingly strong. The bad news is that Dogmeat is the only companion you can't order or control, so they're liable to cause some problems if you end up in combat but don't want to attack certain targets. The only other noteworthy thing I found in Junktown was one guy who likes to fight random creatures in cage matches that you can bet on. Surprisingly nice guy, can't fight for shit. Junktown is mostly a stopover point for the hub, where the real trading goes down, where the caravans convene, and the Iguana trailer sells Doc Morbid's meat. You can confront Iguana Bob on his selling of human meat with the Soylent Green reference, but as I stated early in the game, I feel there's a missed opportunity to turn him into the police. You can blackmail him for money, which I then forgot to collect. You can get him to aggro you in combat, which didn't go too well since the guards and police will attack you thanks to your friend and mine Dogmeat. Or you can let him get away with it. It's especially odd because there's another quest in the same town to turn someone else in, which we'll be talking about now. In the hub, there are a variety of places to get jobs. The Fargo Traders, the Water Merchants, reportedly, I never actually got a job from them, the Crimson Caravan, and the Maltese Falcon. The Falcon is a shady establishment, a casino with a history of violent takeovers. So of course I take a job for their boss. I hit, because my work on Gizmo was a smashing success, and subsequently went straight to the police to rat on them. Doing so brings you to a violent confrontation between the police and Decker, the current head of the Falcon. With like 20 reloads, a couple of grenades, and a dead dog, violent crime in the hub falls out of fashion, and just as I caused this, I can fix this. 2 dilapidated buildings in the east end of town feature really nice people who hug and kiss all travelers on sight, and give them money. One group of gangsters starts shooting on sight if you open their door, and another group of drug dealers start blasting if you ask too many questions. The gangsters were holding hostage a member of the Brotherhood of Steel who will reportedly put in a good word for you since you helped them out. The drug dealers dying doesn't amount to much, their clients don't even acknowledge it. I'm pretty sure the dealers can function as merchants for chems in the game if your character has an active chem addiction. Chems give temporary positive effects but run the risk of addiction, creating negative stat effects until the chem is used again. Anyway, this cool, legal, and ethical side of town also features an inconspicuous basement filled with locked doors and explosive traps leading to a thieves guild. If you prove alive enough to get past their traps, their boss will task you with stealing a necklace from the richest man in town. With a decent speech skill, talking your way into the residence is extremely easy. Say you're late to one guy, he lets you in. Say the message is urgent and personal to another, and they let you by without question. Getting the necklace without its owner noticing you is much harder, however. I assume, from the way it was designed, it's intended to be nigh impossible. I reloaded the game so many times trying different dialogue options with the bourgeois fuck, but all of them either aggroed the guards or got me kicked out. The non-violent solution, because the guild doesn't want you to kill the proverbial cash cow, is to use the sneak skill in the skills tab. Initiate combat by clicking your gun so Mr. Hightower's dialogue trigger is disabled, walk past him into his closet, and then lockpick a safe to get the necklace. You repeat the same process in reverse to leave. Otherwise, you have to wipe out an entire troop of his guards and the Thieves Guild will be disappointed in you. Oh no. The Thieves Guild is a bit of a thematic shift from what most quests are in Fallout, both in the sense that the guy who gives you the quest is ripped straight out of medieval fantasy, and because you're generally not expected to use stealth skills for much else aside from opening locked stuff. Almost never for quests. It was refreshing. The major conundrum of the hub is attempting to resolve the disappearances of the major caravaneers of the wasteland. Inquiry reveals that it could be interference and crime from rival caravans, the mythical Deathclaw creature, or mutants. We know it's mutants, but in truth, it's also Deathclaws. They're real, and alone, they're not the threat they're made out to be. I seem to have failed this quest, so don't take my word about the conclusions. All of the above could be true, and in some ways are, but it's mostly the mutant thing. Lastly, the simplest way to get about from a first visit to the hub is to utilize the jobs of the Crimson Caravan Company to get to other settlements. They pay you to protect a caravan for the trip, so it's a no-brainer to accept if you know where you want to go. I went straight to the Brotherhood of Steel because they have the good technology, which I cannot exaggerate how much is needed, and because one NPC told me they don't let people in unless they're with a caravan. On the trip there I reloaded far too many times until I got easy combat encounters because Deathclaws and mutants together decimated the caravan and raiders stole my wallet and soul. Getting into the Brotherhood is apparently more complicated for the Vault Dwellers since the guards at the entrance tasked them with finding some vague old technology in a place known as the Glow. They send you off to a distant, irradiated nuclear crater to die. At least if you find the tech, they either pity or fear you enough to let you join. The Brotherhood is a great source of information and power, with the faction holding all the best old world technology. For rescuing that guy from the hub, We're given the pick of several powerful items, and the only real choice is the power armor, which basically makes you invincible to anything other than critical hits. Plus, it boosts strength by 3. There's a second set of power armor you can get from the Brotherhood, but it's unlikely any character could ever carry 2, and there's no real reason to take more than 1. There's also a quest to upgrade the power armor too, but not the way I played. The Brotherhood base also lets you get surgery to magically be better in just about every way. The problem with these surgeries is that they're somewhat expensive and can take up to several in-game weeks to complete. If you're wondering why my ending was so poorly executed, this is why. My character spent months in a medically induced coma. The Elders of the Brotherhood will also task the player with investigating the military base to the north, which is where the super mutant conversion tubs are. This quest gives you access to either a sniper rifle, laser pistol, power fist, ripper, or rocket launcher. Despite having no big gun skills, the rocket launcher sounded like the most fun. And was. After dealing with the military base and blowing up herds of super mutants, most players are likely to end up heading to what remains of Los Angeles, the Boneyard. Here we're first introduced to the residents of Adaptation, run by a group called the Regulators. They're a little militaristic but seem to be doing well for themselves. In here we meet a father who regales us with his mourning for his son Josh, killed by another gang of the Boneyard called the Blades. As such, the father tasks us with taking the head of their leader. Instead of going in guns blazing, meeting with the Blades reveals them to not be the violent faction they were made out to be. In fact, the leader of the Blades, Razor, yes, Razor Blade, was in a relationship with Josh, who was realizing how the people of Adaptation were being manipulated and used by the Regulators. Josh wasn't killed by Razor. Josh knew too much and was killed trying to tell his father. I chose to believe Razor, whom I also decided to help by getting a shipment of armor and weapons so they could combat the Regulators. To get the armor, you have to take out a nest of Deathclaws and their eggs between the Blades residence and the Gunrunners base of operations. Doing so convinces the Gunrunners, who funnily enough run guns, to give the shipment to the Blades. What follows is simultaneously the best and worst encounter in Fallout. You can either go straight in to help the Blades take on the Regulators, or try to convince Josh's father about the truth first. I tried, but it does nothing. Not only does he go batshit and not believe you, but he gets immediately shot by a Regulator standing next to him. This is when the largest battle in Fallout starts. Razor and several members of the Blades come in full combat armor and stage a full-scale war with the Regulators. You're supposed to help, but I was so tied up in the chaos and confusion that I just started watching until I noticed that Regulators were consistently shooting civilians, and civilians were not against the Blades in any capacity. The battle went on forever because each turn involved every NPC, important or not, having an action. Moving takes time, and they only move one at a time. In the sheer numbers of that battle, which includes everyone in Adaptation set to combat AI, it was one player action every several minutes. It was the most tedious thing ever, confusing as hell because half the time you have to move the camera all the way across the map, and I somehow loved it. It was chaotic and it was wonderful, like the game trying to impress players with what the engine can do. The Regulators being wiped out, Razor of the Blades will thank us and move into Adaptation. The great thing with this quest, like most in Fallout, is that my expectations and allegiances were completely reversed by the end. I went in expecting a bad gang leader, found militaristic corruption on the other side, and changed the face of the Boneyard in the process. On top of this, the Boneyard also houses the followers of the Apocalypse, the faction of learning. They live in a library and strive for peace. It's a noble goal, but in the wasteland it may be a fruitless one. The leader of the followers is more than willing to help the player deal with the children of the cathedral, and for a faction of peace, way too happy to see violent means for this task. Most of Nicole, the leader's dialogue, is about her distrust of the children of the cathedral. It really comes across as largely unfounded theory crafting on her part and speculation about a sect that most seem to be okay with. Just because she was right doesn't mean that the assumptions aren't fucked up. She'll give us a code word to help us with an infiltrator to the Children of the Cathedral headquarters. The followers are a cool faction, all things considered. They've got a ghoul that you can either have a pleasant conversation with or be an asshole to on the lower level. While I'm generally willing to praise the game's dialogue choices, I do find it weird that a lot of games, not just Fallout, usually only have two choices: nice and complete prick. Being led to the cathedral marks the beginning of the end of the game, and overall the adventure is a great experience. The game has a really unique flavor of storytelling and world building that makes repeat playthroughs encouraged. I absolutely missed some pretty vital and interesting events, but what I learned of the world was enough for me to feel satisfied with my understanding of the story. Fallout was a bit of a passion project for lead producer and designer Tim Cain, originally developing it based on the tabletop RPG system known as GURPS, or Generic Universal Role-Playing System. Rolls off the tongue. The appeal of GURPS for this project, and generally, was to be able to have a framework to create any kind of RPG in any setting with moderate ease. Cain worked pretty much alone for several months of development before getting additional assistance from other Interplay employees that could be convinced to work on it. The game's development staff grew slowly over time as it evolved into a more concrete product that publishers could take interest in, but Tim still had to fight with the publisher to keep the project from being shelved in its early days. It took 3 years of chaotic development before the game could finally be released in October of 1997. Fallout, of course, was critically acclaimed for its time, with near-perfect scores and extensive praise from major publications of the era. As an RPG, Fallout was considered one of the best of its time, an impressive feat in a year that also saw the release of Final Fantasy VII and Diablo. Modern reception of the classic fares just as well, inspiring a wide degree of retrospectives, reviews, fan illustrations, mods, video essays, and more. The game was excellently received and continues to be an inspiration to the design of many games and developers. The Fallout development trifecta have gone on to be a little bit of a legend in the CRPG scene, consisting of Fallout creator Tim Cain, as well as fellow designers and lead artists Leonard Boyarsky and Jason Anderson. While Fallout was their first major endeavor as project lead, Tim would go on to produce a sequel before moving on to found Troika Games with these same fellow Fallout designers. Their future works included Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, both lauded as incredible even if technically unstable role-playing experiences with excellent concept, writing, art direction, and player freedom in design. Tim continues his work in the games industry, primarily in collaboration with Boyarsky and Obsidian Entertainment for The Outer Worlds and its upcoming sequel. Their unwavering commitment to providing players with unique adventures with open-ended and morally ambiguous quest design and writing still remains a standout performance in terms of role-playing game development, and their contributions to the genre should not be understated. Furthermore, the contributions of the myriad of staff who worked on Fallout should be considered with as much respect, as the years of work that went into the game show a passion and commitment to a project that publishers almost let die. I'll give credit to the programmers for making a game that, unlike its Bethesda-made sequels, only ever crashed once. For making a well-put-together game with many design contingencies, they deserve commendation alone. The artists who took the primary ideas of the game and made them into something real and visual deserve mention as well. Also, to prove that I was right about the clay modeling. Thank you, Scott Rodenheiser, for that. Much of the design credit should also be attributed to Chris Taylor and their tabletop influences. Not the Dungeon Siege Chris Taylor, the other one. The writing and dialogue to Marco Green, the excellently subtle audio work of Charles Deenan and company. To Mark Morgan for the beautiful and appropriate soundtrack. To the well-done voice direction by Jamie Thomason and the great performances across the board, including Cree Summer, Kath Soucier, Jim Cummings, and Clancy Brown. They got Mr. Krabs in my Fallout. Everyone who worked on this game deserves a commendation for their work, but to do so would take an exceptional amount of time. I always implore people to examine credits to see who worked on the projects we admire. It can be a valuable experience to see what else staff members have worked on or would go on to contribute to. It can also be inspiring to see the real people who found a way to make their passion, assuming what they did is their passion, into not just a full project, but a living for themselves. Not to mention, Fallout's credits wish you a nice day, which is lovely for a game where I brutally dismembered dozens. As touched on previously, Fallout would see a sequel, eventually developing into a franchise that achieved a simultaneously loved and hated reception. Cain, Anderson, and Boyarsky had mild involvement in Fallout 2, which was also very well received, before leaving to found Troika, and the rights to the series eventually were purchased by Bethesda. Some spin-off games were made in the interim, but post-Bethesda, the series has held mixed reception. Fallout 3 was praised at release and still has a decent community surrounding it. New Vegas, developed by Obsidian Entertainment under Bethesda, is the crowning jewel of the series with the largest, or at least most vocal community surrounding it. Fallout 4 is received as mixed to poor by most, more often used as a modding platform than as an actual game. And Fallout 76 had a disastrous start, but has apparently gotten adequate to better with time. It also has a TV show now that people seem to like, which has for a time brought the series into cultural attention again. Stories for another time, perhaps. But the original Fallout is a unique experience, one that is well crafted in nearly all aspects and was a landmark release for its time. It still plays well and holds players' attention throughout the whole adventure. It's varied, it respects the player, and it gives a level of freedom that many other games to this day still struggle to accommodate in their design. As somebody who's never previously been able to click with CRPGs, I can say I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Fallout and look forward to the possibility of playing its sequel in the future. Also, New Vegas is better, bite me.